Something is wrong here. You would think the purpose would be obvious. That once you look at it, the answer would already be there. And usually, that is enough. We see a thing, we place it where it belongs, and we move on. That is what we expect. That is what feels normal. But this one does not settle that easily. The more you hold on to the obvious answer, the less comfortable it feels. Not because it disappears, but because something around it does not sit where it should. It still looks close enough, familiar enough, easy enough to accept, and yet it keeps leaving a small gap, a quiet one, the kind you almost ignore at first. Then you notice it again. And once you do, the simple answer starts feeling a little too simple. So what was its actual purpose of use? At first, the object seems to explain itself. A rolled papyrus lies beside a wrapped mummy inside a painted wooden coffin, close enough to the body to look less like decoration than equipment. If it was placed there at burial, then its purpose appears direct. A guide carried into the next world. The text supports that reading. On a long strip, rows of jackal-headed and crocodile-headed guardians stand before narrow gates, each threshold paired with words that look less like praise than address. Names, epithets, commands. Not a memorial then, but a set of responses prepared in advance for checkpoints ahead. That reading grows firmer a few columns later. A vignette shows a heart balanced on a scale opposite a feather, a small seated baboon above the beam. The whole scene arranged with the clarity of instruction. The dead will be judged. The papyrus supplies what must be known when judgment comes. Nearby, the deceased stands with raised hands before Osiris. The image is not crowded with earthly biography. It is procedural. Approach. Speak. Survive. For a moment, the use seems settled. The role was buried as a practical afterlife manual. Then the practical details begin to press. A manual for whom, exactly? The mummy cannot unroll a sheet over a meter long, cannot scan columns, cannot pause at the correct gate and locate the correct formula. Some copies are folded tightly, some sealed in cases, some placed under wrappings or against coffin sides where no reading posture is imaginable. If the text had to be consulted like an ordinary document, its placement is awkward to the point of absurdity. Perhaps consultation was never the point. The spells may have worked by mere presence. That would fit the burial position. The papyrus as a protective deposit, active, because it accompanied the dead. The images would not need to be read line by line, if their inclusion itself carried force. A written answer could stand in for a spoken one. A scene of successful judgment could prefigure the result. Yet the writing resists being reduced to silent presence. The gate spells are not generic blessings. They are specific, segmented, often keyed to individual beings and moments. The heart-weighing material is not just an image of safety, but a sequence of declarations tied to a hearing. If presence alone were enough, why preserve such procedural precision? Why list obstacles separately, as though each required its own verbal handling? The papyrus in the coffin still insists on transport into the tomb. The text on the sheet still insists on use. Those two facts sit together, but not comfortably. Was the roll meant to be read by the deceased, recited over the deceased, or deposited as a written substitute for speech already performed? Step 1 gives the strongest simple answer available. A funerary guide meant to help the dead survive the afterlife. The tomb placement, the guardians, the scale, the audience before Osiris all point there. But the object remains physically closed at the very moment it is supposed to become necessary. And that leaves the central question open inside the coffin with it. At first, the object seems easy to classify. In one case, a funerary papyrus stops after a handful of columns. In another, a manuscript runs so far along the display wall that the eye loses the beginning before reaching the end. If this thing was a guide for the dead, the difference appears practical. Some owners bought a short version, others a fuller one. A reduced manual and an expanded manual. That would explain the lengths. Then the columns are compared spell by spell. The short roll does not simply compress the long one. It contains some chapters the longer copy omits, A densely written papyrus from one burial includes sequences absent from another owner's deluxe manuscript, even though both claim to prepare the deceased for the same passage beyond death. If survival depended on a fixed set, why do the contents drift? Why does one burial stop after a gate spell, while another spends space on transformations, names of beings, and courtroom formulas? The answer seems to sit in the writing itself. In several manuscripts, black ink runs in regular columns until a gap interrupts the line. Into that gap, a personal name appears in red. The structure is standardized. The owner is inserted. That makes the object look less like a single authored book and more like a prepared framework, adjusted for whoever commissioned it. The variation in contents begins to make sense. Different people, different selections, different needs. For a moment, that explains the disorder. Then the pages with images are laid beside the text-only sections. One manuscript alternates between carefully painted figures and bare columns where no image was ever added. Another leaves spaces large enough for vignettes that never arrive. Elsewhere, a painted scene is finished, while the adjacent text is abbreviated. If these were tailored with care to individual requirements, why do some copies look only partly coordinated? Why does customization produce unevenness instead of precision? The burial contexts sharpen the problem. In one chamber, a short roll lies near the body, modest and direct. In another tomb, a long papyrus sits coiled in a wooden box, densely inscribed, almost excessive in scale. The difference could still be personal choice, but the physical arrangement suggests something else. Not just selecting needed spells, but selecting how much written funerary equipment a burial should visibly contain. Length begins to look like a statement as much as a safeguard. Yet the manuscripts resist becoming mere display pieces. The inserted names are too persistent, too embedded in the formulas to be decorative afterthoughts. The omitted and included chapters are not random enough for ornament alone. A short copy can preserve a crucial scene while skipping others. A long one can lavish space on passages another burial ignores. The pattern is selective. But selective according to what? Danger anticipated? Budget? Workshop stock? Family preference? Ritual advice? The more the roles are compared, the less book fits C. What sits in the tomb is not one stable composition, but a set assembled from available, recognized units. The evidence on the page keeps narrowing the question. If each burial received a different combination, and if names were inserted into pre-existing textual frames, then the real issue is no longer what the Book of the Dead was called. It is how these combinations were chosen, and for whom that choice was meant to matter. At first, the object seems easy to classify. In one burial, a papyrus runs nearly the length of the sarcophagus. In another, only a short strip lies near the body. The longer copy carries broad, painted scenes in saturated blue and red, figures carefully outlined, registers balanced across the sheet. The shorter one compresses text into narrow columns and ends quickly, set beside the chambers that contain them. The pattern invites a practical answer to the question of purpose. These were funerary provisions, certainly, but also scaled possessions. More space, more pigment, more scenes, more status. The workshop material supports that reading. Several sheets preserve the same black outlines, repeated from copy to copy, with empty spaces left where names would later be inserted. The layout is regular enough to suggest stock production. A buyer did not begin with a unique composition. A buyer selected from prepared forms. If the manuscript could be ordered in advance, lengthened, painted richly, and personalized late in the process, then perhaps its actual use was not mainly in the afterlife at all. Perhaps it functioned first as a burial luxury, a visible marker of means translated into funerary form. That explanation sits comfortably in front of the expensive copies. A papyrus spread over a gilded coffin lid, its vignettes enlarged and heavily colored, behaves almost like another prestige surface in the burial assemblage. The painted scenes are not hidden in the making. They are meant to be seen before the roll is folded. Wealthier burials contain longer copies. The workshop repeats templates. Names are slotted into blanks. The object begins to look less like a singular guide and more like a commissioned funerary display. Then, the unfinished rolls begin to interfere. One manuscript stops mid-column. The ruled lines continue, but the text does not. Another preserves image spaces, never filled, yet both were buried anyway. If the point was complete visual display, why deposit a manuscript whose incompletion would have been obvious at a glance? If the point was textual protection, why leave blank sections where further material was expected? The workshop model still explains the templates, but now, the practical question sharpens. What minimum condition made a roll usable? The answer might be ownership rather than completion. A blank cartouche is useless. A filled one binds the manuscript to a person. Once the name is inserted, perhaps even a partial roll can serve. That would account for why standardized outlines mattered, and why unfinished copies still enter tombs. The essential act may have been not finishing the whole object, but assigning it. Yet the long and short copies remain awkward under that solution. If naming alone activated the manuscript, why do the richest burials still accumulate length, pigment, and elaborate scenes? Why does one chamber receive a roll extending beside the entire body, while another receives only a narrow strip? The difference is too systematic to dismiss as accident, but too materially uneven to reduce to pure utility. A protective device should not need deluxe painting. A status object should not tolerate abrupt incompletion. So the papyrus sits in two conditions at once: standardized enough for workshop output, variable enough for personal tailoring, incomplete in some tombs, lavish in others. The question of actual use narrows rather than clears. Was the roll valued for what it said, for what it showed, for whom it named, or for the fact that it had been properly commissioned and placed? The evidence on the sheets answers each of those in part, and the tombs keep refusing to choose only one. At first, the purpose seems easy to pin down. A spell begins with a line in red ink, larger than the black signs beneath it. A heading set apart as if it were an instruction, rather than part of the composition. On several manuscripts, the same pattern repeats: red above, black below, then another red directive. If the roll were only a burial ornament, why mark out performance cues so carefully? The wording itself presses in the same direction. Certain chapters do not merely describe safety. They promise it, if known, if spoken, if recited. That sounds less like decoration than use. The pages support that impression. One vignette shows a figure with a falcon head, but the image does not dominate the sheet. Text is packed tightly into narrow columns around it, compressed as though the words carry the operative weight, and the figure only identifies the transformation at stake. Nearby, another chapter is organized around a serpent stretched across the page, with writing crowded around its coils. Not a general hymn then, but a response to a particular danger. A gate, a snake, a tribunal, a hostile being. Each chapter appears to answer a specific obstacle. The manuscript begins to look practical, almost procedural. A sequence of verbal tools for conditions expected after death. That explanation holds until the same formula turns up elsewhere. A coffin panel bears a protective line in vertical columns. The same wording appears again on a plastered tomb wall. A condensed version is cut into a small green amulet. The papyrus is no longer the only place where the speech is stored. If recitation was the point, why duplicate it across surfaces that do not unfold, cannot be read in sequence? And in the case of the amulet, reduce whole compositions to a few compressed signs. The words seem to need presence as much as utterance. Then the red rubrics become harder to ignore. Some are explicit performance labels, but they sit inside objects sealed into burial assemblages. A text that says, "to be recited," and is then enclosed beside a mummy raises a practical problem. Recited by whom and when? Before burial? During rites? By priests? By the deceased in the next world? The manuscripts do not settle the timing. They preserve speech in a form that can outlast the speaker. The serpent chapter sharpens the problem. Its focus is narrow, almost tactical, aimed at one threat rather than at prestige or display. Yet the same burial may distribute protection across wall, coffin, and amulet, as if no single medium were trusted to carry the whole burden. The papyrus, then, is not simply a luxury object, But neither is it just a script waiting to be read aloud once. It behaves like stored ritual speech, portable, repeatable, transferable across materials. Still, the physical layout keeps asking for a more exact answer. If the words were meant mainly for activation in ritual, why preserve so many chapters in tombs where no living reader would return? If they were meant mainly for the dead to deploy, why mark them with headings that resemble instructions for performance? The evidence keeps both possibilities in view. A text spoken, a text deposited, and somehow a text still expected to work after the voice has stopped. At first, the papyrus seems to answer the question by itself. A funerary manuscript lies in a tomb. Therefore, the manuscript must be the working device. The dead needed written guidance, and the roll supplied it. That explanation holds as long as the roll remains the center of the burial. Then a coffin interior comes into view. Its wooden boards carry vertical columns of text, and on the wall just behind it, a matching phrase appears again, copied in a different hand across plaster. The duplication is awkward if the papyrus was meant to be the single essential instrument. Why repeat the same protection on two fixed surfaces that cannot travel with the body in the same way a roll can? Repetition begins to look less like redundancy and more like distribution. Perhaps the purpose was not to place one complete guide with the dead, but to surround the burial with overlapping protections. That starts to fit the material spread. Beside one mummy, no papyrus survives at all. Instead, small amulets rest on the chest and throat, each carrying tiny incised formulas compressed into a few signs. Painted spells cover the coffin boards. The burial is not empty of protection. It is saturated with it, only in smaller and harder forms. If salvation depended on possessing a manuscript, this burial should look deficient. It does not. It looks provisioned by another route. So the papyrus begins to seem less like the mechanism, and more like one component among several. The evidence supports that for a while. Coffin texts, wall texts, amulets, and rolls all carry related language. Protection appears to have been modular, transferable across surfaces. A spell could live on wood, plaster, stone, linen, or papyrus. The dead were not relying on one object, but on a system. Yet the chronology on the walls complicates that neat arrangement. In separate rooms, similar funerary columns appear on Old Kingdom pyramid stone, on a later wooden coffin panel, and on a still later papyrus. The wording overlaps across centuries, but the formats do not. If the purpose was simply to distribute the same protection across available surfaces, why preserve some formulas through such long material migrations? Why move them from architecture to coffin to portable manuscript at all? The persistence suggests that the wording itself mattered, but the changing support suggests that no single support was indispensable. That raises a narrower question. What exactly was the papyrus doing that the coffin and wall were not? Portability is one answer, but it does not fully account for burials with no roll. Completeness is another, except some coffin programs preserve substantial sequences on their own. Condensation on amulets offers a clue in reverse. Their inscriptions are too brief to replace a long text, yet they were placed at specific points on the body, as if location could substitute for length. The coffin encloses, the wall bounds, the amulet anchors, the papyrus accompanies. And still, the arrangement resists settling. In some burials, the same formula appears twice within arm's reach, once on the coffin and once elsewhere in the chamber. In others, the roll is absent, but the protective network remains intact. The Book of the Dead, then, was certainly used, but used as what? A master copy, a portable reserve, a ritual supplement, or one strand in a funerary mesh whose effectiveness depended on repetition across materials rather than on any single text at all. At first, the purpose seems straightforward enough when the painted scenes are set side by side. In one tomb painting, the owner sits at a banquet with an unfurled papyrus across his lap, the roll broad enough to be legible as an object, not just a symbol. In another, a long white roll is presented before a shrine table loaded with offerings. If the manuscript belonged only to the sealed tomb, why show it above ground, in scenes of social life and formal presentation? The easiest answer is that the roll had already entered the owner's world before burial. It was not merely packed for later use. It was commissioned, possessed, and displayed while the owner was still alive. That explanation gains weight on the workshop bench. A papyrus there already carries the owner's full name and titles, repeated through several columns in the usual places where the text addresses or transforms the deceased. The writing is not waiting for death to identify its subject. The identity has been embedded in advance, as if the manuscript had to be prepared while the owner could still pay for it, inspect it, perhaps even approve its contents. A funerary object then, but one made in the living world for a future moment. Yet the workshop evidence raises a practical problem. If advanced preparation was the point, why repeat the names so insistently? The same titles recur column after column, not just once at the opening. That pattern looks less like ownership marking, and more like activation, as though the text needed to keep fastening itself to one specific person. The manuscript begins to look less like stored equipment, and more like something meant to operate through repeated identification. Then the burial rite scene intrudes. Priests stand beside a coffin. From one attendant's hands an open roll hangs downward, visibly unrolled during the ceremony itself. The papyrus is not tucked away as grave furniture. It is exposed, oriented toward the right, apparently in use before deposition. That physical position matters. A closed roll beside a mummy can be explained as provision. An open roll, in the middle of the funerary procedure, suggests performance. The manuscript may have been read aloud, or at least treated as if its words had to be present in voiced form at a specific stage. That would account for the repeated names. If formulas were spoken over the dead, the owner's identity had to be inserted wherever the speech required a subject. The manuscript would function partly as a script for ritual specialists. The tomb paintings of owners holding the roll could then record possession of a text that priests would later activate. But the painted owner holding the papyrus across his lap remains awkward under that arrangement. The scene does not show a priest, a lector, or a funerary chamber. It places the roll in the owner's own hands, in a setting that belongs to cultivated life rather than mortuary procedure. And the presentation scene before the shrine table pushes the same difficulty further. The owner is not merely associated with the manuscript. He is shown offering or displaying it. If the roll's operative moment depended on priestly recitation at burial, why preserve these images of personal handling so carefully? The object now sits in 2 times at once. On the bench, it is prepared in advance for a named individual. In painted scenes, it is possessed and presented by that individual while still among the living. In the right, it appears open beside the coffin, as though its words had to be brought into action before the tomb was closed. The question is no longer whether it was for the dead or for the living. The harder question is where its use actually began. At first glance, the purpose seems straightforward enough to measure. A personalized papyrus roll rests in the tomb beside the mummy, close enough to count as equipment rather than decoration. The owner's name repeats in red through the columns. That repetition looks procedural. If the text is meant to work for one dead person, then the name has to be embedded wherever the danger appears. A finished papyrus made for a named owner lies folded in a wooden case among grave goods prepared before burial. That placement suggests advanced commissioning, not an improvised burial extra. The object begins to look like a funerary instrument prepared in life, stored, then deployed at death. That explanation holds, while the roll remains in isolation. It becomes harder to keep once the same burial is opened out. A coffin side, a cluster of amulets, and a papyrus in the same burial each bear separate lines of protective writing. The wording overlaps. Not always line for line, but enough to show that the papyrus was not carrying the whole burden alone. If the roll was the mechanism, why duplicate formulas on wood and stone, and small inscribed objects placed directly on the body? Redundancy is possible, of course. Protection in layers. Yet some burials preserve the surrounding protections more clearly than the papyrus itself, and the system still appears complete enough to function on its own terms. The question narrows. Was the roll the central device, or one component among several media expected to cooperate? Then another detail presses in from the manuscript surface itself. An open funerary manuscript shows a red rubric above a spell, larger and more directive than the black text below. To be recited changes the practical setting. A text deposited for a dead owner can still be read by no one. A text marked for recitation points toward performance. The role is no longer only something placed, it is something sounded. That would explain why copies were made during the owner's lifetime, and why names and titles were inserted throughout standard compositions. The text had to fit a specific person before burial rites began. For a moment, this seems to settle the matter. The Book of the Dead was prepared in advance, activated in the ceremony, then left with the deceased to continue its work. But the burials do not line up neatly enough to leave it there. Different tombs contain different spell selections. Some rolls are compact, some extensive, and the variation does not map cleanly onto one fixed ritual sequence. If priestly recitation were the primary use, why do the selections diverge so much from owner to owner? Why preserve one danger in detail and omit another entirely? The variation looks less like a script everyone had to perform, and more like a toolkit assembled according to anticipated needs, budget, family choice, local workshop practice, or all three at once. That returns the papyrus to the tomb, but not to passivity. A named roll placed beside the mummy, a rubric calling for speech, repeated formulas on coffin boards and amulets, and evidence that the manuscript existed before burial all point in the same direction, without quite becoming a single mechanism. The text seems to have been commissioned by the living, fitted to an individual, brought into funerary performance, and then deposited where its written presence could continue beyond the rite. What remains difficult is deciding where its main force was thought to reside. In the spoken chapter, in the written copy, in the repeated spread of the same formula across multiple surfaces, or in the fact that all of these were arranged around one named body at the same time.